Hello. The Casey Boland family, Poetry Ireland, and Stanford University welcome all of you to this tribute to Evan Boland. The title of this event is Beautiful Speech, a poem by Evan from her collection In a Time of Violence. We're gathered here with the support of so many artists and friends of Evan, who I will introduce in a moment. But we're also gathered due to the generous support of Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs and the US Embassy in Ireland, as well as the Consulate General of Ireland in Washington and in San Francisco. A year ago today, we lost one of our finest and truest poetic voices. Evan was an immensely talented leader in Irish poetry, particularly as an art activist and pathfinder for women. She was an artist of immense influence with a hugely impressive body of work, and throughout her career, she was a relentless advocate for emerging voices. She was a revolutionary poet, a searing talent, but also to so many people, to her peers, students, and readers, she was a kind, supportive, and unfailing friend. It's hard to imagine that a full year after her passing, we're not able to gather to celebrate her life and work. And it's also impossible for us to cover all of her achievements in an hour and 15 minutes. But we have gathered some great artists to talk to you about her, just to mark her anniversary, a small tribute. So first up, we have Paula Meehan and Tobias Wolff, followed by Paul McCarrick, Maria Hummel, Roisin Kelly, Bruce Snyder, and Dr. Jodie Allen Randolph. And the final words are from Evan's family, from Sarah Casey, Evan's daughter. I know that you're going to thoroughly enjoy all of the contributions. Thank you.
The afterlife of a poet is a mysterious thing. For Evan Boland's family, for Kevin Casey, for her daughters Sarah and Evan, and their families, it is only a year since the terrible shock of her leaving. And I know I speak for so many when I send our condolences and our heartfelt sympathies to them. I stand with her friends and colleagues and with her students who were to Zoom workshop with her that very last day. Students she was so determined to make space for and to resource. And I stand with her neighbours here in Dundrum and across the ocean in Stanford. And I know that we will stand by each other and carry her name and her memory into our own futures. For her poems, wherever they go, there is another afterlife echoing down the tradition which she changed alchemically, a kind of pure magic. She's had a particular destiny in the fates of so many women poets of her time. And she will have a particular afterlife in the generations to come. She foretold it indeed, writing of a young woman poet bent over her pages. This time, when she looks up, I'll be there. The poets who come after her, whatever their gender or none, move now through a different, more available air. In her great poem, Anna Liffey, to the goddess Liffey, for whom the river is named, the river is the very source of the city itself. The river narrates the city, she writes. When Jodie Allen Randolph, her great friend and biographer, and myself looked for an image for the cover of this book, Evan's Poems of Dublin, we used a photo she'd taken herself of one of the river heads that adorn the old Carlisle Bridge, the bridge that spans the river from O'Connell Street across to the south side. The granite river heads are lit at night, and this one, in Evan's black and white original, the head of the goddess Liffey herself, looks like she is under surveillance. My sister Antoinette Milne photoshopped Evan's photo in the colours of Dublin's coat of arms, and suddenly it was the absolute spit of her, as we say, the very image of Yvonne when she was a young poet. Last week, the Irish jockey Rachel Blackmore rode into the history books on the winner of the English Grand National at Aintree on the Little Beauty, Minella Times. Interviewed before she even dismounted by a reporter who made much of her being the first woman to win that race and the Gold Cup at Cheltenham a fortnight before, Rachel Blackmore said that during the race she didn't feel like a woman, she didn't feel like a man, she didn't even feel like a human being. Yvonne Boland, and here I fancy her riding the winged horse Pegasus, wrote in Anna Liffey, "In the end, it will not matter that I was a woman. I am sure of it. The body is a source, nothing more. There is a time for it. There is a certainty about the way it seeks its own dissolution. Consider rivers. They are always en route to their own nothingness. From the first moment, they are going home. And so, when language cannot do it for us, cannot make us know love will not diminish us, there are these phrases of the ocean to console us. Particular and unafraid of their completion. In the end, everything that burdened and distinguished me will be lost in this. I was a voice." Truth, to the ancient Greeks, was literally not forgetting. And we are gathering to remember a woman for whom not forgetting was an imperative, a stay against darkness, a tool to open new pathways and powers in poetry. This in a country that had serious issues of amnesia as she grew to womanhood and into her apprenticeship in this ancient art, an art that precedes literature, that holds a certain kind of witness, a certain kind of music, a certain kind of memory in an unbroken chain from the Neolithic, an art that now makes the jump into machine memory, as once it made the jump from the oral to the written. And with every shift in technology, a shift in authority, the place of poetry is always a contested space. Who gets to write it? Who gets to read it? Who is listening and who wants to hear it? And where the silences are. With every new generation, too, a shift in the terms of engagement. The Irish poem being made right now that will electrify us is just as likely to be written by a poet whose people have just arrived here, who brings new blood and energy and patterns of making. Then again, it could be by someone who goes back in matrilinear vision to the Tuatha De Danann, our Bronze Age ancestors. Or more likely that the poet will be one of their babbies, a result of the conversation between what was and what is yet to be imagined. The last time I saw Yvonne was here in Poetry Ireland, the Christmas before she died. The place was jointed, right across the generations. There was an overspill from the function rooms, up the stairways, into the hallways, and just a great buzz. She was launching Poetry Ireland Review, the last one she edited. She was standing in a space she had so often graced since the house opened as the home of Poetry Ireland. She was generous to and supportive of the folk in here, of the then director Maureen Kennelly, of Paul Lenihan, the publications officer, of Jane O'Hanlon and Anna Boner and Moira Cairn-Duff, the education wing of the organisation, of Elizabeth Mohan and Owen Rogers and all the volunteers and interns. Supportive she was too of the myriad projects, the teeming life of work that goes on in this beautiful house. The waves of affection that night, that Christmas night, were palpable. The love and respect mirrored back from the community she was such a valued part of. And she was happy to be home for Christmas, home to Kevin and Sarah and Ivan and their partners, and especially to the grandchildren, her absolute pride and joy. The stories of generosity and kindness that constellate about her are many. She had a gift for seeing the wounded in the rifts and fractures of a complex and fluid community, and she was particularly sensitive to the vulnerable and to those who felt excluded. The strangest question I was ever asked: is there a glass ceiling in Irish poetry? Glass? No. Granite, and you have to chip your way out, letter by letter. And thankfully, now we hope a redundant question in a literary culture transformed beyond recognition since Yvonne Boland published her first poems as a young student. This place I stand now, this beautiful Georgian home of Poetry Ireland, Éigse Éireann, at the heart of Dublin, is no stranger to the strong language, fiery language, incendiary language even, of activism. It was here in number 11 on the evening of the 1st of November 1887 that the National Club held its inaugural dinner meeting. Its members included Maud Gonne and the old Fenian John O'Leary, muse and mentor respectively to W.B. Yeats, were members and speechified here. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave, you might remember. James Connolly, our great Labour leader who hoped to unite the working classes of Belfast, of Glasgow, of Dublin, spoke here. Charles Stewart Parnell spoke here, and the streets outside were thronged. They contested and argued and debated what it might mean to be an independent nation. Yvonne Boland took on a lifelong exploration of what it meant to be a woman poet in that nationalist tradition. It was a central and fruitful preoccupation, and it was a preoccupation she would root in poetry of such lyric grace, in what she called a civil tongue, and root in poems about Dublin, this city so completely realised visually and emotionally in the poems. She worked when a student just down the street in the Gresham Hotel. She studied in Trinity College a little bit further down the street across the Liffey, and everywhere there were statues erected to heroes and nation builders. She lived in the leafy Victorian suburbs south of the city and settled under the mountains in the suburb of Dundrum, where herself and Kevin started their family, raised their daughters. There she mapped a particular world in what she described as indoor nature poetry, the poetry of the night feed and the body's cyclic demands on a young mother. That she brought that world right into the centre of our tradition in poems of power and accomplishment is our great good fortune. I want to finish by reading a poem from her last collection, The Historians. One of the things I love most about her poems is the Irish weather, how she uses its endless changing moods to set the very tone and visual charge of her lines. I spoke earlier about the afterlives of the poet and the poems. I find her all over this city. If I look to the south, to the mountains that frame the vanishing point of so many of Dublin's streets. When I look up, she'll be there. So then, to finish, rain. I was born in a place where rain is second nature, where a hooded coat ready on the hook was never out of reach. Nor do I believe, like Plato, or even his late revisionists, that landscape is the corporeal purpose of our minds. I always knew rain was a dialect I could listen to on a winter night, its sibilance. Even now, on a wet evening, I watch as twilight comes to the old graveyard above the main road of our village, and I am glad for whoever lies there that this elemental companion has not and never will abandon them.
I first met Evan in Syracuse, New York, when I was teaching there. Raymond Carver and Tess Gallagher had met Evan and were great fans of her work, gave me her poems to read, and so we invited her to read at Syracuse, and I just loved her poems. The kind of familial, anti-heroic tenor of the poetry. She, if there was heroism, it was a kind of domestic courage that she found in the lives of families and the relationships between parents and children. It happened a few years later. I was being interviewed for a job at Stanford, where she had become the director of a creative writing program. And I hadn't really had much chance to talk to her when she visited Syracuse, but I did when I came out for the interview. And I would not have guessed that we would end up becoming close friends. In fact, Evan became one of the best friends I ever had. When I first met her out here first met her at Stanford for my interview, she was very correct and formal, professional, even a little grave, and I admired the way she dealt with my visit. I didn't imagine we would be great friends, but when we got home, my wife found a bouquet of flowers waiting that Evan had sent. This great kind gesture of hers actually was the prelude to this great friendship that we enjoyed. Because when I did take the job and come out here, all that reserve kind of quickly melted away. We had a tremendous rapport and a lot of fun. The thing with Evan was that once you were her friend, all the filters came off. You did not ever have to pretend for a moment to be a better person than you were, or to be less interested in gossip than you might be, in dissecting a colleague or talking in hilarious terms about the absurdity of a meeting that you'd both been in. At the same time, she was, as director of the program, she was a consummate professional. She was her father had been the Irish ambassador to the United Nations, and later the ambassador to France and to England. So she grew up in diplomacy, and boy, she had that art down to a T. I used to love to watch her navigate the politics of the English department here, and she knew just where every lever was to be pulled. And she wasn't above drawing on her Irish a bit to show a little temper if some was needed, and people always backed down. I must say that there was a time or two when I encountered that temper myself, and I certainly always backed down. She could be quite ferocious, and then immediately afterwards we were great friends again. People commented that whenever I would visit her office, they would hear the sounds of laughter outside. She was very funny, and at the same time, she was, as I said, a kind of extraordinarily proficient, competent person. Most writers don't like directing creative writing programs. Most writers will do anything not to direct a creative writing program. She really loved doing it, and she was really good at it. She could do budgets. She could do a budget at one moment and be mentoring a student, which she did a lot of, at another. She enjoyed excelling at directing the program, and God, she was good at it. And she was also an adept at technology. She, in fact, had actually built computers at one point on her own. She loved computers. She loved whatever was new in technology she was interested in. So she knew how to code. She knew how to build computers. And just as an example of how good she was, I was having a problem one day with my computer. It looked like it had pretty much crashed, and I called the IT people here at Stanford, who were very good, and they had someone in my office. And you know, you can't just walk out on somebody who's working on your computer. You have to pretend that you know what they're doing and stand over them and seem to comprehend what's going on, which of course I didn't. But it was a problem, and this very good IT person who had worked with me before just couldn't seem to figure out what it was that was wrong with my computer. Yvonne had the next office to me. She was on her way home, and she happened to notice my door was open, and that I had the IT guy in there, and she stood in the doorway and then came in and said, "What seems to be the problem, Toby?" And so I told her, and she watched the guy for about 30 seconds, and I could see she was really getting impatient. And she said, "Can I have a try?" And he was very happy to surrender the hot seat to her. And she sat down, and she had the thing fixed in about 2 minutes. She was so good at that stuff. And I'll never forget once flying over to Ireland. My wife and I were flying over to Ireland for a literary festival there, and by sheer coincidence, Yvonne happened to be on the same flight. She was going home for a vacation from Stanford. And we were about 2 seats back from her. And it was really funny to watch. You know, she lowers her, tray table, and it became a kind of digital work center. She had her laptop up, she had phones, MP3 players. Of course, she had the headphones on and the earbuds on. And I mean, it was like, I don't know, NASA headquarters in Houston. It was amazing to watch her. But the part of her life here that was devoted to the students, she had a tremendous sense of family, which is something you see in her poetry, and something I really admired. Her way of making family life as dramatic as poetry in the more heroic mode. And she extended that sense of family. Oh God, she loved her family, her daughters, Yvonne and Sarah, her husband Kevin, and her grandchildren, and was always showing me pictures of them, on the grandchildren, on her phone, and quoting back to me funny things that Ella or Jack had said. And she extended that sense of family to the program she directed for over 20 years. It took she was not interested in thinking about herself much, talking about herself ever. Her gaze really went outward. She thought about other people. That was what she was interested in. How do I get a bigger stipend for our fellows? How do I get more classes for this lecture so they can have the minimum they need to get benefits? How do I get more benefits for my fellows and my lecturers? What should I do about this lecturer of mine who's pregnant and is going to need some time off? How can I get her some extra benefits? That's what she thought about. And she was just amazing at getting things for those she cared about. She would go over and shake the deans until the change fell out of their pockets to get things for her students and people who taught in her program. She soon became, as I said, a great friend of mine and our family. Spent a lot of time with us. We had dinner together a lot. She was particularly fond of my two boys were away most of the time then in college when we first came out. But my daughter was much younger and was at home, and she fastened all her attention and love on my daughter, Mary Elizabeth. Sometimes aggravatingly for me, because Mary Elizabeth wanted a dog, and we traveled quite a bit at the time, and I really did not want the burden of a dog. But she took Mary Elizabeth's part and just beat me down until we got a dog, which of course then we loved, and it became. But I would never have gotten that dog except for her browbeating and lobbying for my daughter, who just adored her. And indeed, when my daughter dropped out of college for a year at one point and was at home, very interested in writing, Evan arranged for her to take creative writing classes from one of our best lecturers at Stanford, Molly Antipole, and it was a life-changing event for my daughter. It just revived all her interest in reading and writing. She took care of people. I was talking about her kind of rejection of the heroic mode of not just in poetry but in life. I'm going to read a poem of hers that I think captures that really beautifully. It's called Heroic, in fact. Sex and history, and skin and bone, and the oppression of Sunday afternoon. Bells called the faithful to devotion. I was still at school and on my own, and walked and sheltered from the rain. The patriot was made of drenched stone. His lips were still speaking. The gun he held had just killed someone. I looked up and looked at him again. He stared past me without recognition. I moved my lips and wondered how the rain would taste if my tongue were made of stone, and wished it was, and whispered so that no one could hear it but him, "Make me a heroine." What a beautiful, complex poem. It's really, of course, a rejection of the heroic, because the hero is a stone. He can't feel. She has skin and bone. She can. It's it's what you have to turn yourself into to become that sort of statue, the sort of person who becomes a statue. At the same time you capture the girl's almost enchantment with the notion of that kind of transcendence, if you will, of the human. It's an extraordinary poem, I think. What she sees as truly heroic in her work, as I believe in her life, is what happens between people, between even sometimes just two people. Perhaps I could read one other of her poems, maybe her most famous poem, Quarantine, which is about exactly that. In the worst hour of the worst season, of the worst year of a whole people, a man set out from the workhouse with his wife. He was walking. They were both walking north. She was sick with famine fever and could not keep up. He lifted her and put her on his back. He walked like that west and north, until at nightfall, under freezing stars, they arrived. In the morning, they were both found dead, of cold, of hunger, of the toxins of a whole history. But her feet were held against his breastbone. The last heat of his flesh was his last gift to her. Let no love poem ever come to this threshold. There is no place here for the inexact praise of the easy graces and sensuality of the body. There is only time for this merciless inventory. Their death together in the winter of 1847. Also what they suffered, how they lived, and what there is between a man and woman, and in which darkness it can best be proved. That is the heroism that we find in Evan's poetry. It is not the stony heart, the willingness and glorification of a killing. No, it is this quiet, terrible loyalty that she memorialized in that poetry, that also reaches out, as she herself says, to the history of a whole people, her people. Well, she was a great poet and a great friend. And like many great friends, she sometimes knew her friends better than they knew themselves. I'll close with a memory. I took a year off to finish a book in the early 2000s, and my wife and I and our daughter were living in Rome. And as I was coming to the end of that time, I thought, I think I'll just keep writing. Maybe I don't really want to teach anymore. I loved that year. So I sent a letter of resignation to her to pass on to the chairman of the English department, and saying that I would come back and teach the following year, as I'd agreed to do. But after that, and during that year, they would need to start a search for my replacement at Stanford, and I'd be happy to take part in the search. So I did come back, and actually I was continuing to write okay, and I was teaching, and But at a certain point, I realized, if they're going to replace me, they've really got to get a search going. And I didn't think they had even sent an advertisement out. So I went to Ivan and said, I'm happy to help with the search for my replacement, but you really got to get going on this. It's getting late. You can't really advertise it much past Christmas, and the job much past Christmas. And she said, are you really sure you want to do this? And in fact, I was enjoying being back and teaching and seeing other writers, enjoying her company of my friends. And also, I had two sons who had just finished college, but I had a daughter coming up, and I knew how expensive it was going to be. And I thought, well, honestly, Ivan, I might have thought differently about it if I were writing the letter now. And she said, oh, I'm so glad to hear that. She reached into her desk and gave me my letter. She had never sent it to the chair. She knew I would. She knew she could. She knew if she held on to the letter that I would probably want to stay. And she didn't want me to start the machinery of my departure. But it was an incredibly presumptuous of her to intercept my letter like that, and I was so glad she did. It was the act of a dear friend. I loved her. I loved her work. I miss her terribly.
My name is Paul McCarrick. I'm an emerging poet from the Midlands in Ireland. I was a member of the 2019 Poetry Ireland Introduction Series, and I am feeling very fortunate and incredibly honoured to be asked to take part in this tribute to the wonderful Eavan Boland. It's hard to know where to start when paying tribute to someone as amazing as Eavan, but I suppose at the very beginning, coming across her work in school, poems like The Famine Road or Warhorse, Child of Her Time, whatever the subject, Night Feeding as well, you were always met with this voice that was sure and distinct and powerful, and always in control. And that was something that drew me into her work, and it was very comforting knowing you were in safe hands. You were in the safe hands of this poet, come what may. It was, even in her later work, or other works, you could see the vibrancy and life in there, still with this really strong voice. One thing I suppose you can't necessarily take from that work is that she was so amazing as a teacher, and I was lucky enough to get a brief experience of that, I suppose, in 2018. As part of the Kilkenny Arts Festival, Poetry Ireland hosted a workshop, and myself and 7 other writers were giddy in excitement when we were able to work with Eavan on our poetry. We had no real other option but to kind of be in awe of this woman who was so intelligent, so whip smart, so quick, when we were showing her poems and reading her poems. And it was amazing that in each of our own kind of way we wanted to pay tribute, whether it was in a phrase or a reference or a style or a subject of the poem, to Eavan, to kind of say thank you for being you, thank you for your writing. And Eavan wasn't having any of that. She wanted to know what we wanted to write. She wanted to know our poems. She wanted our poems, our writing, to be the best it could possibly be. And she was so generous and so compassionate during that time. And afterwards, she did stay in touch. And I was fortunate enough to be asked to be the featured poet in the last issue of Poetry Ireland Review when Ivan was editor, and that's something that I'll hold very close to my heart. Ivan was compassionate, she was intelligent, she opened up the world of possibilities about what poems could be, what subjects could be, how to present things, and she encouraged me to stay away from the dangers of indirect speech and really harness the energy that I had already, I suppose, and focus that on the experience of the collective, of the humane, the collective lived experience we all have, to get the best out of reality. And that's something that I really try to write towards all the time. I could go on about her incredible mind and just grace and generosity and everything, but there's probably an awful lot more people with a lot more authority to speak on those things. So the best way to finish up, I believe, is to read a poem, one of my favourites from the historians, and it is called The Fire Gilder. She loved silver, she loved gold, my mother. She spoke about the influence of metals, the congruence of atoms, the art classes where she learned these things. Think of it, she would say as she told me to gild any surface a master craftsman had to meld gold with mercury, had to heat both so one was volatile, one was not, and to do it right, had to separate them and then burn, burn, burn mercury until it fled and left behind a skin of light. The only thing, she added, but what came after that I forgot. What she spent a lifetime forgetting could be my subject. The fenced-in small towns of Leinster, the coastal villages where the language of the sea was handed on, phrases bruised by storms, by shipwrecks. But it isn't. My subject is the part wishing plays in the way villages are made to vanish, in the way I learned to separate memory from knowledge, so one was volatile, one was not, and how I started writing, burning light, building heat, until all at once I was the fire gilder, ready to lay radiance down, ready to decorate. It happened with "it never did," when all at once I remember what it was, she said. The only thing is, it is extremely dangerous.
Hello, my name is Maria Hummel, and I know we are here to talk about Evan Boland to each other, but I really just want to speak directly to you, Evan, because there were so many things I would have liked to thank you for in life, and you never would have allowed it. I mean, the instant someone stammered an appreciative comment, you would get this very stern look or suddenly be very far away down the hall. I met you as a Stegner Fellow. We used to meet behind this kind of nondescript door upstairs in the Margaret Jacks building that opened to a room that was cluttered with old books left behind by other professors, and had a round table, and the 10 of us poets would file in, followed by you, and you were smaller in stature than most of us, and older, and it was sort of like having a bird alight at the table with us, definitely a raptor. But the stakes of the conversation as soon as it began with you were so high, and that was because you believed so firmly in the power of poetry and had such conviction in us as poets that we could contend with the questions of history and poetry in our own ways, and that we would get there, but that it would be hard, and that we would have to test ourselves and question our motives and our ironies. And it was just a place that still inhabits my imagination, those workshops, because they taught me so much, not just about how to write a better poem, but how to be a poet in the world. And when there were conversation lulls, you would rap the table with your knuckles and say, move it along here. Or you would lapse into stories of famous poetic friendships, like the friendships between Denise Levertov and Robert Duncan, or Elizabeth Bishop and Robert Lowell. And you were really interested in them, not only in how they formed, but how they fell apart over these questions of literary ethics, like Denise Levertov and Robert Duncan, and how in their letters they began to disagree over the Vietnam War, and Levertov's poems about the Vietnam War, and Robert Duncan writing back, the artist's role is not to oppose evil, but to imagine it. Those questions I think you inhabited as well in Ireland, and you were full of purpose in making us see, I think, how our own friendships and our own lives as poets were almost as important as what we put on the page. And for you, family was first. We were family, and your family was family. And I wanted to read this poem, Against Love Poetry, because it has meant so much to me over the years. We were married in summer 30 years ago. I have loved you deeply from that moment to this. I have loved other things as well, among them the idea of women's freedom. Why do I put these words side by side? Because I am a woman. Because marriage is not freedom. Therefore, every word here is written against love poetry. Love poetry can do no justice to this. Here, instead, is a remembered story from a faraway history. A great king lost a war and was paraded in chains through the city of his enemy. They taunted him. They brought his wife and children to him. He showed no emotion. They brought his former courtiers. He showed no emotion. They brought his old servant. Only then did he break down and weep. I did not find my womanhood in the servitudes of custom, but I saw my humanity look back at me there. It is to mark the contradictions of a daily love that I have written this, Against Love Poetry. I live in Vermont. It's April 1st. There's a giant snowstorm going on outside with snowflakes as big as the pad of my thumb. And I was out walking today, and the snow was falling all around me, making it hard to see anything else. And it was so sensual and so real, this storm around me, and so directly upon me. But as I passed a yard, there was a flock of blackbirds in the yard, and they rose up and rose away at an angle to the snow. And that is an analogy for your poetry for me, in the way that you deliver us with this directness and sensuality, a world of a marriage, a world in the story of a king being paraded through the streets. And then there's this line, I did not find my womanhood in the servitudes of custom. And then it's like those birds rising up and away and enabling us to see how the context of a history and the context of women's lives can reshape our thinking of individual autobiography. Alexandra Teague, in her wonderful posthumous reflection on you that was on the Poetry Foundation, said that no other poet so taught us about the ethics of perspective. And I really believe that. And I really see how your insights were like those birds that pull us up and away out of the context of our lives and enable us to see the whole situation of our lives. And I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful for everything you taught me as a teacher, everything you taught me as a person, as a wife, as a mother. I got to close this off before I start crying. Thank you, Evan, and we miss you so much.
I first read Evan Boland's poem Outside History when I was living in Leitrim, whose population in 1841 was 155,000. This population was subsequently devastated by the famine, and 174 years later has not recovered. Today, Leitrim is home to only 32,000 people. I'm always struck by how empty it is, by the desolation of the land for miles and miles around, in which the lights of only a handful of houses shine in the night. But the emptiness of this landscape is offset by the thousands of stars that burn overhead. And Evan was among those who taught me to look upwards, to attempt to comprehend the incomprehensible, that the light from these stars has come to us across the universe many years after it was first emitted. In Evan's words, light that happened thousands of years before our pain did. It will also take Earth's light thousands of years to reach the depths of the universe. In a sense, because the light emitted in our past is still travelling, an event like the famine is still happening, or even has yet to happen. And so Evan taught me not only to look up, but to turn my gaze downwards, to listen to the land, to feel around me the roads clotted as firmaments with the dead. How slowly they die, Evan writes. When does the point of death occur? If someone on a faraway planet had a telescope powerful enough and trained it on Earth, they would not see the surface of the planet we inhabit. They would see the past. They might see Leitrim as it was 174 years ago, and watch in real time its people starve, die, and emigrate. We are like that alien someone with a powerful telescope, who, even as they witness our pain, are powerless to prevent it. We are too late. We are always too late. But although we cannot change the past lives. It runs parallel alongside what we call the present, and indeed quantum physics suggests that past, present, and future all occur simultaneously. There is solace to be found in the theory that death does not mean cease to exist. In her poem Amber, Evan writes, "Reason says this: the dead cannot see the living will never see the dead again. But reason has no place in either quantum theory or poetry, both of which offer evidence of another reality, and which Evan glimpses in the fossilized resin from ancient forests. Trapped in the amber are seeds, leaves, and feathers, which now seem as alive as they ever were, as though the past could be present, and memory itself a Baltic honey. We are caught in the hardening sap of what we perceive to be our world, trapped by the human construct of time, and yet there is beauty to be found in grief, a surfacing of the past everywhere we look, reminding us that nothing ever really dies or is lost. Almost exactly 2 years ago, a friend drove me from Cork to Leitrim. It was an overcast, humid day in May. We drove slowly up through Tipperary, Laois, Offaly, Westmeath, Longford, and the hedgerows on either side of the road were foaming and flowering with white hawthorn, the air heavy with its distinctive musky smell, which comes from the chemical triethylamine, one of the first chemicals produced by a decomposing body. It's a smell our ancestors would have been familiar with in the days before embalming, as they sat with bodies during wakes. It is this link with death that likely gave rise to the superstition that hawthorn was not supposed to be brought into the house. It's a superstition that has a particular resonance now. Many of us cannot travel west or go to where the hawthorn is flowering. This time not because of an instinctive warning embedded in our genes, but because of something much more tangible, a deadly virus. The journey made this time 2 years ago from Cork to Leitrim is like a dream from another lifetime, driving slowly for the sake of it in a way that seems unthinkable now. The poem of Ivan's I want to read is White Hawthorn in the West of Ireland, a poem about leaving the suburbs behind and heading west. Although we are currently experiencing a scale of death and negligence almost more incomprehensible than the old light of the stars that speckle our skies, we are also the possessors of a heritage that is primitive, elemental, and pagan. In her poem, Ivan yearns to embrace the hawthorn, as we yearn for the day when we can leave the limits of our immediate vicinities. And with or without our presence to witness it, the cycle of hawthorn continues, a loop of time circling in on itself, flowering this year as it has done for thousands of years, an emblem of the essential, the eternal, with its chemical scent, death and life intertwined. White Hawthorn in the West of Ireland by Evan Boland. I drove west. In the season between seasons, I left behind suburban gardens, lawn mowers, small talk. Under low skies, past splashes of colt's foot, I assumed the hard shyness of Atlantic light and the superstitious aura of hawthorn. All I wanted then was to fill my arms with sharp flowers, to seem from a distance, to be part of that ivory downhill rush. But I knew, I had always known, the custom was not to touch hawthorn, not to bring it indoors for the sake of the luck such constraint would forfeit. A child might die, perhaps, or an unexplained fever speckle heifers. So I left it, stirring on those hills, with the fluency only water has, and, like water, able to redefine land, and free to seem to be, for anglers, and for travellers astray in the unmarked lights of a May dusk, the only language spoken in these parts.
Hi, I'm Bruce Snyder, and I'm really honored to have a chance to say a few words in memory of Evan Boland. I knew Evan for almost 18 years, first for 2 years as a Wallace Stegner Fellow, where I worked with her in workshop, and then I went on for several years as a Jones lecturer and taught at Stanford. And I can say without a doubt that Evan is and was the most important teacher that I ever had, especially in terms of my poetry. And I remember lots of people I know have talked about the experience of workshopping with Evan. She was intense, and the stakes were high, and she challenged us at every turn. She was also incredibly funny. I think not enough people talk about how funny she was. And I learned many, many things there, partly just watching her think about poetry. But I think, one of the things that was the most important to me of everything that she taught me was the distinction that she often made between history and the past. And that history was this record of events written by people in power, and that the past was something much more complicated, and it included the lives and experiences of people whom history might have erased. And she argued, I think, both in her work and in her criticism, that one of the projects of the poet could be to insist that history reckon with the past. And I think this was especially a powerful message for me. I think as a young gay man, young gay writer who had grown up in rural Indiana, in a very small town, from a working class family, and particularly someone who had, I think where I came from, telling somebody that you wanted to be a poet was like telling them you wanted to be a giraffe or something. I mean, it really, we weren't just far from the centers of literary production. It just, poetry just seemed to have no presence there in some ways. Certainly not, at least, it didn't seem that the lives that we lived would be important enough for the poem. And I think one of the things that Evan gave me as a writer was to understand that absence was in fact my subject, and that the life I had lived there was the material I needed to write into poetry and into the history of poetry. It was transformational. It's something I come back to still. It's something I tell my students, which is that, you know, if you don't see your life or your experiences reflected in poetry, in literature, it's your job to write them into it. That is all from Evan Boland. And I can't say enough about how grateful I am to her for that. The other thing I would say, you know, the last time I saw Evan was a very chance encounter. I had actually was in London. I had gone to visit my dear friend, the poet Charlotte Leslie, who was a Stegner Fellow with me, and we both worked with Evan, and we just happened to see an advertisement saying that Evan was being honored by an Irish literary organization in London, and that she would be giving a talk and be doing a Q&A on stage. And so we canceled all our plans. We took the train to London. We showed up totally, she had no idea we were coming. And I remember, you know, she did a bit of a double take, I think, trying to understand, you know, London and us, how did we fit together? And then she just opened her arms and gave us a huge hug. And she laughed and we talked, and she was funny, and we gossiped, and it really was an amazing final meeting. And you know, on our way home, Shar and I remember on the train, the two of us headed back to Oxford, we're talking about the huge impact that Evan had on, not just on us and our writing, but on so many of our friends, not only in terms of the writing itself or career and so forth, which of course she did, but in terms of the friendships that she was a part of forging. That Shar and I, you know, our friendship was forged in part in this little room in Margaret Jacks Hall at Stanford with Evan Boland, and that she would always be a part of that, and that she would always be a part of all of these friendships that continue to sustain us as writers. So I really hope, you know, I know Evan will always go on to be known as the great poet that she is. I hope that she will also be remembered for her legacy as a great supporter of writers, and that as much as she lives on in her own poetry, she also lives on in everything they write, and in all of their achievements, and in the relationships and the friendships, the community that she was a part of forging. So I know that I am just deeply honored to have even been a small part of that legacy. And I just want to say, Van, thank you so much for everything that you did. I could never really express what it's meant to me and to my work. So thank you so much for listening.
Hello, everyone. Jody Allen Randolph here, speaking with you from a beautiful April evening in California. From the late 1980s until last April, Evan Boland and I talked regularly about poems. We spoke first in the cafeteria at University College Dublin, where I was writing a doctoral thesis on Yeats, and then later at the back of the Montrose Hotel in a cafe before she dashed off to collect her daughters, Sarah and Evan Francis, from school. We often talked late at night by telephone. We talked about poems written by her contemporaries around the world. We talked about poems written across history, and we also talked regularly about her poems. One particular day in 1990, my journals tell me, we talked about the poems in Nightfeed, about how they had germinated in a particular poem. On Christmas Eve in 1975, Yvonne had given birth to her first daughter. 6 weeks later, she sat down to write a poem about the monotony of caring for a small family. Even now, she told me, she could still feel that excitement of a glittery first frost combined with the huge excitement of a first winter and a first child. On that winter morning, she'd had a strong premonition of visionary excitement and of the inevitable professional isolation that would follow. And here's a short passage from that poem, Monotony. My late tasks wait like children. Milk bottles, the milkman's note, cold air clouds, the rinsed, milky glass, blowing clear with a hint of winter constellations. Then, as now, Boland was a careful imagist. Look at how the weather and constellations are made to center around a recycled domestic object. The empty bottle becomes the center of the perspective through which the wind and the clouds and the stars are reconstellated. While the influence of Sylvia Plath is clear here, there is an earlier, more powerful influence at work, and that's Boland's mother, the artist Frances Kelly. As a painter's daughter, Yvonne was particularly attuned to visual images of domestic interiors. But there's a way of life that is its own witness, she wrote in the opening poem of Nightfeed, dedicated to her husband, Kevin Casey. Put the kettle on, shut the blind. Home is a sleeping child, an open mind, and our effects shrugged and settled in the sort of light jugs and kettles grow important by. The first time I heard Yvonne read was in the late 1980s at the Yates Summer School in Sligo. She was reading from her most recent books, Nightfeed and The Journey. It was electrifying. She read the poems about children and domestic interiors in an angry, defiant voice. I didn't know Yvonne then, though I had read her work. After the reading, I went back to the social center where I fell into conversation with a prominent poet who had lingered at the bar during the reading. Why weren't you at the reading? I asked. He answered with his own question. Have you ever heard of something called the middle class? Middle class crap about babies and houses. The following year, Boland came to teach a seminar at University College Dublin. She was in her early 40s by then. I was in my late 20s. My first journal article had just been accepted on her work. She had read it, she said, and did not care for it. Come for a coffee after class and I'll tell you why, she offered. In the conversation that followed, she gave me 2 pieces of advice that changed the way I thought about criticism and have served me in good stead. 1, you cannot make a good critique from a bad poem. And 2, you should not use a poem as a pretext for theory. Boland was no stranger to theory herself, I discovered, but the conversation moved quickly on to American poetry. Which poets did I read, and which poets did I admire? We chatted about specific poems by Adrienne Rich, Louise Glück, Mark Strand, and Joy Graham. 30 years later, last April, we were still at it. I credit that post-reading conversation with the prickly male poet with my change in thesis topics from Yeats to Boland. I credit my long friendship with Yvonne to our shared love of poetry. Her daily life as a poet was one of utmost dedication to poetry as an art with a long history, and to poetry as a craft learned through disciplined practice. I never saw Yvonne write, but I heard her write and revise on the phone late at night, and sometimes she rang in the morning with more edits before she went to work. She insisted that I listen to a poem before I read it on the page. At times, poems arrived slowly for Yvonne, and she grew impatient with herself. She kept notebooks with images and shards of language that gradually, like metal filings around a magnet, assumed a definite shape. In my memory, the poem Eurydice Speaks came together like that. The image of the gas ring burning blue flowers came first. It floated in and out of different poems before landing in this one. The order of the images in the poems constellated, then broke apart. Ivan picked the pieces up and put them down for months at a time, then came back to them. When the image of a shadow striding home in a raincoat arrived, the poem was anchored, and in one final swoop, the pieces became the finished poem. Eurydice Speaks. How will I know you in the underworld? How will we find each other? We live so long on the physical earth. Our sky is littered with actual stars. Practical tides in our bay. What will we do with the loneliness of the mythical? Walking beside ditches brimming with dactyls by a ferryman whose feet are scanned for him, on the shore of a river written and rewritten as elegy, epic, epode. Remember the thin air of our earthly winters. The gas ring burned blue flowers. Frost was an iron underhand descent. Dusk was always in session. And no one needed to write down or restate or make a record of or ever would and never will the plain spoken music of recognition. Nor mark how I stood at the window, the hills darkening all around, saying as a shadow became a stride and a raincoat was woven out of streetlight, I would know you anywhere. At other times, poems arrived quite suddenly. I remember first hearing Quarantine that way. A short, mysterious, oddly powerful little poem, Ivan said as she started to read it to me over the phone. Another poem that arrived complete with very little revision was The Blossom. This is what I remember. One spring night in 1992, we were deeply engaged in a late night chat about the poet Philip Larkin. We were both night owls, but Ivan was growing alarmed. One of her teenage daughters had not come home yet. At 2:30 a.m., she rang off. The next morning, she rang to say her daughter had been found accidentally asleep at the house of a friend. It had been a long night. Ivan had not slept. Want to hear a poem? She asked brightly. The Blossom. A May morning, light starting in the sky. I have come here after a long night. The blossom on the apple tree is still in shadow, its petals half white and filled with water at the core, in which secrecy and the freshness of dawn are stored, even in the dark. How much longer will I see girlhood in my daughter? In other seasons, I knew every leaf on this tree. Now I stand here almost without seeing them, and so lost in grief, I hardly notice what is happening as the light increases, and the blossom speaks and turns to me with blonde hair and my eyebrows and says, imagine if I stayed here, even for the sake of your love. What would happen to the summer, to the fruit? Then holds out a dawn-soaked hand to me, whose fingers I counted at birth years ago, and touches mine for the last time and falls to earth. Ivan often described herself as an indoor nature poet, and I think that was true in a double sense. She brought the outdoors inside and she carried the indoors outside. That sense is here in The Blossom, where Boland invokes the myth of Ceres and Persephone, and it's here where the daughter's fingers turn into petals and fall to earth. It's also there in a recent poem, Without End, where she weaves together myth and family life with the power and mystery of seasons and arrivals. Ella, Jack, and little Julia, her grandchildren, all wander into the poem by name. The youngest, much-loved grandchild, Kian, had arrived just before Christmas, a few months before Ivan's departure. Yvonne resisted the occasional temptation to rewrite a poem written by her younger, less skilled self, but we often talked about which poem she felt hit the mark, which didn't, and why. In Her Own Image had tonal flaws, The Pomegranate had a time fault, Child of Our Time had an ethical flaw, etc. Flaws which sometimes only she could see, but which bear witness to her rigor and discipline. We sometimes had running themes in our conversation: the love poem, the political poem, poems of the California landscape, poems of the English landscape, the short poem, the long poem, the middle distance poem, the sequence. The last conversation thread I remember, and perhaps this was a subject of her workshops at Stanford, I don't know, was poems that were almost great, but weren't because of a fatal flaw, a wrong turn. We were talking of poems by other poets, but of course she was revising poems from the historians. I said she resisted the occasional temptation to rewrite published work, but in her final book, she slipped one past me in a poem called How We Were Transfigured. In Against Love Poetry from her US publisher, W.W. Norton, in 2001, she had published a poem by the same title. When proofs for the Carcanet edition arrived, same book, different title. It was Code in the UK and Against Love Poetry in the US. The poem was gone. I asked her why she was pulling the poem. It wasn't good enough, she said. The handling of scale was not right. 20 years later, the poem returns in The Historians, published 7 months ago, substantially revised, with the same title, showing us the difference between a poem that was nearly good and a great poem. How We Were Transfigured. Now, when darkness starts in mid-afternoon, when evening shows an early, half-sliced winter moon, I remember days when I never thought twice about what was further out from the four walls of our house, from the hills above it, from our infant daughters sleeping in it, or what lay in wait for us on the Irish Sea as darkness moved off and away, and we slept late, oblivious to the rain's drizzle, the tap and flicker of it, to what was coming, silently, insistently, to render our lives visible to us again. Light, the builder, light, the maker, fitter of roofs to gutters, of the tree's root to the tree's height, of earth to sky, assembler of openings at the river's mouth and the mind's eye. I wish I could tell you we discussed this revision, but we didn't. She would pause each time she read this poem to me over the phone and ask hopefully, "Were you thinking something?" I wasn't. A few months ago, I found my notes from our last conversations, added in my haste to a shopping list. What she was reading, what she was thinking last March and last April, after Stanford shut down for the pandemic and she returned home to Dublin to her family. She was happily at work on 2 new poems, Pestilence and Winter City. Winter City is not about the city you see, but about the city you imagine, she said, speaking, of course, of Dublin. It took 15 pages, she said, to get 4 lines. She talked more about Pestilence, what she described as a middle distance poem about a visionary moment in history when everything was disintegrating. She had grown up surrounded by the myth of tuberculosis, she explained. Her father's brother and her mother's sister had died of it. And she was writing in part about the helplessness of that. Was it about our pandemic too, I asked. It is, and it isn't, she answered. You'll see. I can still feel that magic of these poems that she did not live to finish. But she left us so much, as colleagues, as friends, as readers, as human beings. But what I'm most grateful for to quote Yvonne herself on grief and memory, are her poems. These beautiful upstagings of what we suffer by what survives. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm Yvonne's eldest daughter. I first of all just want to take the opportunity on behalf of the family to say thank you so much to Niamh O'Donnell and Poetry Ireland for organising this event. We completely appreciate how busy everyone is, so we are so grateful for the time and the effort and the work that has gone into this. We would also like to thank everyone who is participating, many very dear to Mom. Your words and your time mean so much to us too. It is hard to believe that this is to mark a year. A year used to seem like a significant period of time, and now it has just arrived when we are still trying to fully comprehend what happened and how it has just changed everything. It was around this time last year that tributes flooded in for Mom on social media. Many of the tributes were from people who didn't know her personally, but they did also know her through her poetry. They talked of, poems they loved and how much her transformation of the landscape of Irish literature for women and overall meant to them and impacted their lives. We were just overwhelmed by the number that we saw. We also received messages into our Facebook accounts, email, via post, from great friends, from colleagues, many one in the same, and many from her second family in Stamford. We will always be grateful and never forget, how people just opened up their hearts to us to tell us, what Mom meant to them, the great times they had with her, and, what she had done for them. It seems that, she was always doing so much for so many. It really was a pattern throughout her whole life. At the time, we felt such pride in her. And of course, that hasn't changed. In fact, we just feel more proud of her every day. We are so proud of the beautiful work that she leaves behind and of all of her achievements, which even as her family leave us in awe. It gives comfort, I think, sometimes, to think that on a given day, somebody finds one of her poems or they buy her book and they discover the joy of, and gift of poetry through her. And, sometimes maybe more importantly, someone who feels, different or marginalized or is struggling reads about her journey, about her great courage and her resilience and her fierceness to carve her own path, to be true to herself. And they can see that, you can go against the status quo and it can pay off and be rewarding. First and foremost, though, she was a wife and a mother and a grandmother to us. And she is still all of those things, the center of our world. My mum and dad were married over 50 years, which is just amazing. And they were the best of friends throughout all of that. When my mom would wake in the States, without fail, the first thing she would do would be to send an email to my dad or to pick up the phone and call him to set up the many conversations they would have throughout the day. They could just talk about everything and anything for hours. In the weeks before the 27th of April, she was so happy. And even though they were in an almost kind of total lockdown, they could barely leave the house. She was just so happy. And that was so much to do with the fact that she was at home and in the house with my dad. And it was the same for him. In the last year, we've had many milestones, and we've had a first birthday, we had a third, a fourth, a seventh. We had her birthday. We've had Christmas, which she just adored and in many ways made. And we've had some really challenging family times, and we've still had great things to celebrate. And no words will ever be able to properly describe how much we have missed her for all of those. And we just miss her every single day. I don't think we will ever get used to her not being here. No one had a gift to celebrate moments like Mom. She made every day, even just the ordinary, she made it special. And during difficult times, you know, she was our greatest advocate, support, and friend. When I found out I was pregnant, she was just really the first person I wanted to call. When my little daughter was sick for the first time, she spent her whole evening just Googling remedies. And then she got in a taxi to come and be with us. And I know she did the same, you know, with Yvonne and her kids many times. Every milestone, and you know, our children had the first time they crawled, they walked, their first word, everything. Her and my dad just celebrated with us. You know, we think of her every time we pull up to my mom and dad's house. I see her still through the window laughing and looking so happy with my dad. I see her, you know, sitting opposite him in her chair, coming down the stairs to greet us at the door. You know, making food for our kids in the kitchen on our regular visits. I hear them shout out Nana as they came into the house. You know, I think of her weighed down with suitcases coming back from the States. You know, she would come back with a suitcase of presents for them, you know, really just symbols of all her love and her care for them. And that didn't change as she got older and a little bit smaller. In fact, I think the suitcases just got heavier as grandchildren were added. When she would come back from Stamford several times a year, it was just like a light went on. You know, life was just good because she was there. You know, in many ways, myself and Yvonne are very lucky that we get to channel her every day as mothers. We can only show the love and the kindness and care that we do to our children because of her and what she showed to us. They will always know her through that. I'm going to start to finish up by reading one of my mom's poems. I picked this particular one because at times when it has seemed that so much has just been lost, this reminds me of everything that we do have, what she left us, what she passed on to us, and how she lives on every day through us and through our children. I read this poem for my wonderful mom and for my sister, who she wrote this about. This is Legends for Yvonne Francis. Triers of firesides, twilights, there are no tears in these. Instead, they begin the world again, making the mountain ridges blue and the rivers clear and the hero fearless. And the outcome always undecided, so the next teller can say, begin and again, and astonish children. Our children are our legends. You are mine, you have my name. My hair was once like yours, and the world is less bitter to me because you will retell the story. Before I do finish now, I am so pleased to announce the establishment of a new initiative, the Yvonne Boland Emerging Poet Award. This award will be given to 2 emerging poets, one from Ireland and one from the United States. This is an initiative of Poetry Ireland and Stanford University and has been made possible with the generous support of the Department of Foreign Affairs and the US Embassy Dublin, and we thank them for their kind support. The award is a fitting tribute to Mom, who was a relentless advocate for emerging poets, particularly those whose work risked being overlooked. Mum argued ferociously that space for new voices must be made and diversity in all its forms must be cherished. The Emerging Poet Award will consist of a financial prize as well as mentorship for 4 months, and a call for submissions will be open on Mum's birthday, 24th of September. More information is on the Poetry Ireland and Stanford University websites, with submission details made available closer to the opening date. Thank you so much.